I never signed anything that gave them my home, but the moment the funeral ended, they spoke as if it was already gone. The day I buried my husband, Robert Collins, the sky over Texas felt too bright for what I had just lost, and I remember standing at the edge of the cemetery, holding a folded handkerchief I never once used because the tears simply would not come anymore. Everything inside me felt emptied out, as if grief had already done its worst before the ceremony even ended. I thought Jason would at least walk me back home in silence, maybe help me sit down and breathe for a moment. But instead, the moment we stepped inside the house I had lived in for 38 years, he closed the door behind us and said in a calm voice that didn't match the weight of his words, "Mom, we need to talk about the house." Brittany stood beside him, unusually still, her eyes scanning the room like she was measuring what already belonged to her. I remember setting my purse on the kitchen counter, confused more than afraid, and asking what he meant. Jason didn't hesitate. He said the house paperwork had already been handled, that everything was transitioned, and that it would be easier for me to accept it now rather than later. The words felt wrong, like they were spoken about someone else's life, not mine. I told him I didn't understand, that Robert would never have left me without clarity, and that I had never agreed to anything like that. Brittany finally stepped forward then, placing a thin folder on the table. She didn't look at me when she said it was all standard procedure, that families often misunderstood legal transfers after a death. Something about her tone made the room colder than it had been at the cemetery. I opened the folder slowly, expecting something familiar, but the papers inside felt foreign, stamped and formal, filled with language that blurred together under my shaking hands. Jason watched me carefully, not asking if I was okay, just waiting, as if my confusion was an inconvenience delaying something already decided. I remember asking him again, quietly, "Are you telling me I don't live here anymore?" And he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Brittany, and that silence told me more than his words ever could. The house around me suddenly felt unfamiliar, like I was standing in a place that had already been emotionally emptied out before I even realized it. And then my phone rang. It was an unknown number, and for a brief moment I almost ignored it, until something in me insisted I answer. A voice from the bank introduced herself politely, asking to confirm details about the Collins family trust account, and in that moment, I felt the ground beneath everything I understood begin to shift. The silence in the room after that phone call felt heavier than anything I had experienced that day, as if even the walls of the house were waiting to hear what I would do next. I stood there holding my phone so tightly that my fingers began to ache, listening to the polite voice on the other end repeat details about a trust account I had never once been told existed. When the call ended, I did not move immediately. Jason was still watching me, his expression carefully controlled, and Brittany had already started organizing the papers on the kitchen table as if she were preparing a document that no longer needed my permission. I finally asked the question again, slower this time, trying to keep my voice steady. I asked what trust they were referring to and why my name was being used in a conversation I had never been part of. Jason exhaled as if I was making things more complicated than they needed to be, and he said it was all handled by professionals after Robert's passing, that I did not need to worry about details that were already legally resolved. The way he said resolved made something inside me tighten. I walked past them without realizing I was moving until I found myself in the living room, staring at the framed photographs on the wall. Robert and I had built this home together, room by room, year by year, through everything life had given us. I remembered him standing in this very spot one winter evening, telling me that no matter what happened, I would always be protected here. That memory should have comforted me, but instead it made the present feel even more unreal. When Jason followed me into the room, he softened his tone slightly, as if trying to calm me down, and said again that nothing was being taken from me, only organized differently. Brittany stayed behind, but I could hear the faint sound of papers shifting on the kitchen table like quiet confirmation of something I had not agreed to. I asked Jason directly if he had read the documents himself, if he understood what was actually written, and for the first time, he hesitated. It was only a second, but it was enough for me to notice. He told me that the lawyer had explained everything clearly, that I should not stress myself at this stage of life, and that living alone in a large house was not practical. The word practical landed harder than anything else he had said, I looked at him, really looked at him, and realized he was not confused. He was convinced. And that realization felt heavier than grief itself. I turned away again, my mind going back to the phone call, replaying every word the bank had spoken, especially the part about verification and authorization. There was something underneath it all that no one in this room was saying out loud, something structured and deliberate, something that did not match the story I had been given. And as I stood there surrounded by a home that suddenly felt like a question instead of a certainty, I understood that this was no longer about misunderstanding paperwork. It was about who had been controlling the truth long before I ever picked up that phone. The following morning arrived without any sense of rest, as if the night had simply passed over me without permission to heal anything. I remember sitting at the edge of the kitchen table before anyone else was awake, staring at a cold cup of coffee I had not touched, while the house remained unusually quiet. Jason came down first, dressed as if he had already resumed a normal routine, and Brittany followed shortly after, her expression composed in a way that no longer felt accidental. Neither of them asked how I slept. Instead, Jason placed a folded sheet of paper in front of me and said it was a summary from the legal advisor, simplified so I would not feel overwhelmed. The word simplified felt intentional, like something designed to reduce me rather than help me. I unfolded the paper slowly, scanning lines that spoke about authorization, asset management, and beneficiary structure, words that were technically clear but emotionally distant. Brittany pointed out that everything was standard for estates of Robert Collins' size, mentioning numbers as if they were just administrative details, but none of it explained why I had never been informed. I asked them when exactly this arrangement had been created, and Jason said it was during the final months of Robert's illness, when he had insisted on handling financial matters privately. That answer should have felt reassuring, but instead it deepened the uncertainty, because Robert had always told me everything. I remember the nights he would sit beside me at this same table, discussing even the smallest decisions as something we shared equally. Now, according to them, he had made a choice that removed me from understanding my own life. As I tried to process this, Brittany gently suggested that I should consider moving to a smaller home, perhaps something closer to medical services and easier maintenance. She said it with a soft voice, but the meaning underneath was firm. Jason nodded in agreement, adding that it would be safer and more practical for me at my age. I looked at both of them and realized they were no longer speaking about uncertainty. They were speaking about transition as if it had already been finalized. That was when I told them I wanted to speak directly to the bank again, not through summaries or explanations filtered by anyone in this house. Jason's expression changed slightly at that request, but he did not refuse. Instead, he said he would arrange it, but only after I rested and calmed down. The implication that I was not calm enough to understand my own financial reality felt like another layer of control I had not anticipated. Later that day, while Jason was outside and Brittany was on a phone call in another room, I found myself standing in front of Robert's old study door. It had not been opened properly since his passing. I hesitated before turning the handle, and when I stepped inside, the smell of old paper and worn leather brought back memories I was not prepared for. His desk remained exactly as he had left it, organized in a way that reflected his need for order. I moved slowly, not looking for anything specific at first, until I noticed a locked drawer slightly misaligned, as if it had been disturbed recently. My hand paused over it, and for a moment I simply stood there, listening to the quiet of the house. Then I remembered something Robert had once said about keeping important documents closer than people expect. I did not open it immediately. Instead, I sat in his chair, feeling the weight of a truth I could not yet see but already felt closing in around me, as if the answers I was being denied had been within reach all along, hidden not by distance, but by intention. The study felt different that afternoon, as if time itself had thickened inside the walls of the room where Robert used to spend hours organizing documents and reading in silence. I remained seated in his chair, my hands resting lightly on the armrests, trying to understand why something so familiar suddenly felt like it was holding answers I had been excluded from. The locked drawer in his desk kept pulling my attention back, not because I expected anything dramatic, but because Robert had never been careless with anything, especially not something he chose to hide. I finally reached for the handle again, this time noticing how the wood felt slightly worn at the edges, as if it had been opened before more than once in recent days. The realization made my chest tighten, but I still did not rush. When it finally opened, the inside was neatly arranged, not chaotic or forgotten, but intentionally structured, with folders labeled in Robert's handwriting. My eyes scanned the top folder first, and the name on it made me pause longer than I expected. It referenced a private trust agreement dated several years earlier, long before Robert's illness had become serious. I felt a strange stillness in my body as I pulled it out and began reading slowly, line by line, realizing that this was not something created in urgency or confusion, but in careful preparation. The language was formal, but one phrase stood out clearly enough to break through everything else: irrevocable family protection structure. I had heard Robert use words like protection before, but never in a legal sense. I turned the pages carefully, noticing multiple references to oversight, restricted access, and conditions tied to inheritance management. My name appeared repeatedly, not as an afterthought, but as the central beneficiary with full ownership rights preserved regardless of external claims. Yet what struck me most was not what was included, but what had been layered around it: clauses that required transparency and independent financial verification, clauses that should have prevented any silent transfer of authority. I sat back slightly, trying to reconcile what I was reading with what Jason and Brittany had told me. According to them, everything had already been simplified, already finalized. Yet this document suggested the opposite, that nothing could have been changed without formal confirmation and legal acknowledgement. A faint sound from the hallway pulled me back to the present, and I quickly closed the folder, not because I was afraid of what I found, but because I was suddenly aware that someone else in the house might already know more than they were admitting. I placed the folder back exactly as I had found it, but my thoughts were no longer still. When I left the study, the house felt different again, not quieter, but more divided, as if every room now held a version of the truth depending on who was standing inside it. Later that evening, Jason mentioned that the bank had scheduled a formal review call for the following day, and Brittany added that it would likely confirm everything they had already explained. The certainty in her voice no longer sounded reassuring. It sounded rehearsed. I nodded without responding, but inside I knew something had already shifted. The trust document in Robert's desk did not match their version of events, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the story I had been given was not incomplete by accident. It was incomplete by design, and someone in this house had made sure of it. The next morning began with an unusual stillness, not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that makes every sound feel delayed, as if the house itself was waiting for something to happen. I had barely slept, my thoughts circling endlessly around the trust documents I had seen in Robert's study, and the growing contradiction between what I had read and what Jason and Brittany continued to insist was already finalized. Jason came into the kitchen earlier than usual, holding his phone in one hand and a printed email in the other, telling me that the bank had confirmed a formal verification call for that afternoon. He said it in a controlled tone, as if the outcome was already understood, and Brittany added that once the call was complete, everything would finally be clear for everyone involved. The phrase did not reassure me. Instead, it felt like a closing door. I agreed without argument, not because I felt convinced, but because I needed to hear the conversation myself rather than rely on interpretations being filtered through them. As the hours passed, I stayed in the living room, unable to focus on anything, my attention drifting repeatedly toward Robert's study. At one point, I found myself standing in front of it again, my hand resting on the doorknob without turning it, as if I already knew that whatever answers I found inside would not undo the uncertainty, but deepen it. When the bank finally called, Jason placed the call on speaker, and the voice of the representative introduced herself in a calm, professional manner, asking to confirm my identity before proceeding. I answered clearly, stating my full name, Margaret Collins, and my date of birth, and there was a brief pause before she began speaking in a more precise tone. She explained that the purpose of the call was to verify the current status of the Collins family trust structure and ensure that all beneficiaries understood their roles accurately. Jason immediately leaned forward, responding before I could speak, saying that everything had already been explained to me and that I simply needed confirmation. But the bank representative did not acknowledge his statement. Instead, she continued speaking directly to me, asking whether I had ever personally authorized any transfer of ownership regarding the primary residence. The question landed differently than anything I had heard so far, because it did not assume agreement, it assumed verification. I said no, carefully, and there was another pause, longer this time, before she asked me to confirm whether I had ever signed any updated transfer agreement in the past 18 months. Again, I said no. Brittany shifted slightly beside Jason, and I noticed it immediately, though neither of them spoke. The bank representative then stated something that made the room feel suddenly more contained, more focused. She explained that according to their records, the trust had been designed specifically to prevent unilateral changes without dual authorization, meaning that no single beneficiary, including Jason, could legally alter ownership distribution without documented approval from both the trustee structure and the primary account holder. I listened carefully, each word tightening the space between what I was hearing and what I had been told. Jason interrupted again, insisting that there must be a misunderstanding, that legal counsel had already handled everything after Robert's passing, but the representative responded calmly that no such transfer had been fully executed in their system. She said the trust remained active under its original conditions, and that any assumption of full ownership would require documentation that had not been received or validated. The silence that followed was different from before, heavier, more direct. I looked at Jason, not searching for emotion, but for clarity, and for the first time, I saw something shift in his expression that did not match certainty. Brittany lowered her gaze toward the table, her fingers touching the edge of the printed email Jason had brought earlier, but she did not pick it up. The bank representative asked if I would like to schedule an in-person review with a legal officer to examine the original trust documentation in full detail, and I answered yes, without hesitation. As the call ended, the line disconnected with a soft click that felt louder than anything else in the room. No one spoke immediately. Jason looked at me as if recalculating something he had already decided, and Brittany remained still, her earlier confidence no longer visible. I realized then that whatever version of events they had been operating under was no longer supported by the system they believed had confirmed it, and for the first time since Robert's funeral, the uncertainty in this house was no longer mine alone to carry. After the call ended, the house did not return to normal silence, because something fundamental had already shifted inside it. It was no longer the silence of mourning or routine, but the silence of uncertainty, where every small sound felt like it might contain a new revelation. Jason stood near the kitchen counter for a long moment without speaking, his phone still in his hand, as if waiting for the bank to call back and correct what had just been said. Brittany broke the silence first, suggesting that there must be some miscommunication between departments, that large financial institutions often word things differently. But her voice lacked the confidence it had carried only a day earlier. I listened without responding, my attention no longer on their explanations, but on the structure of what I had just heard from the bank. The phrase dual authorization kept repeating in my mind, because it did not align with the idea that my ownership had simply disappeared or been reassigned without my knowledge. Jason finally spoke again, this time more carefully, saying that regardless of technical details, the practical outcome remained the same, that I was still being cared for and should not feel anxious about legal terminology. But the word practical no longer held the same meaning it had before. I excused myself and walked slowly back toward Robert's study, not because I expected to find new answers, but because I needed to confirm what I had already begun to suspect. The room felt unchanged, but my perception of it was not. I opened the desk again, this time pulling out the trust folder I had discovered earlier, and reread the sections more closely, paying attention not just to what was written, but to what was structurally implied. There it was again, clearly stated in formal language that the trust required transparency in all administrative actions and prohibited any single party from altering beneficiary rights without documented approval. The more I read, the more the contradiction became impossible to ignore. If this structure had been active and properly registered, then what Jason and Brittany had described should not have been possible in the way they described it. A faint sound behind me made me close the folder instinctively, and when I turned, Brittany was standing at the doorway, watching me. She did not enter immediately. Instead, she asked softly what I was doing in Robert's study again, and I answered honestly that I was trying to understand what had been explained to me. Her expression tightened slightly, and she said that revisiting documents repeatedly would only create confusion, that it was better to wait for the scheduled legal review. I noticed then that she was no longer trying to reassure me, but to redirect me. Jason appeared moments later, and the two of them exchanged a brief look that lasted only a second, but carried more meaning than their words. I set the folder down on the desk and walked past them without argument, but internally something had already changed. The structure of the story I had been told was no longer holding together under scrutiny, and for the first time since Robert's death, I began to understand that the truth was not hidden in a single document or a single conversation, but in the difference between what was being said and what was being carefully avoided. The days leading up to the scheduled in-person review with the bank felt like a slow tightening of pressure inside the house, where every conversation carried an unspoken weight that no one wanted to name directly. Jason had become quieter, no longer speaking in confident summaries, but instead limiting his words to practical instructions about timing and transportation. Brittany, on the other hand, seemed increasingly focused on organization, as if controlling physical order could somehow stabilize something that was already slipping out of alignment. I observed both of them carefully now, not with anger, but with a growing awareness that their certainty had begun to fracture in subtle ways. The morning of the bank appointment, Jason insisted on driving, saying it would be more efficient and that I did not need the stress of navigating anything myself. I agreed without resistance, but I noticed how he checked his phone repeatedly before we left, as if confirming something that had not yet been resolved. The drive into town was quiet, the Texas roads stretching long and open, but inside the vehicle there was no sense of openness, only distance. Brittany followed in a separate car, and we met her outside the financial institution located in a modern glass building that reflected the pale morning sky. Inside, the environment was calm, professional, and deliberately neutral, with polished surfaces and soft lighting that made everything feel controlled. We were guided into a conference room where a senior bank officer greeted us and asked us to take a seat. The officer placed a neatly arranged folder on the table and began speaking in a measured tone, explaining that the purpose of the meeting was to ensure full transparency regarding the Collins family trust structure. Jason immediately leaned forward, repeating his earlier position that everything had already been settled through legal counsel after Robert Collins passed away. But the officer did not acknowledge his assumption. Instead, she opened the folder and began reading from official records, stating that the trust was established under strict conditions designed to preserve long-term asset protection and prevent unauthorized transfer of ownership under any circumstance. As she spoke, I noticed Jason's posture change slightly, becoming less certain, while Brittany remained unusually still. The officer then turned toward me directly and confirmed that according to verified documentation, I remained the primary protected beneficiary with full legal ownership rights intact, and that no completed transfer of title had ever been registered in the bank system. The words settled into the room slowly, and for a moment no one responded. Jason looked at the officer and asked for clarification, stating that he had been managing the property based on information provided after the estate process began. The officer responded calmly, explaining that management and ownership were not the same, and that access permissions granted for administrative purposes did not constitute legal transfer of assets. Brittany finally spoke, her voice lower now, asking if there was any possibility that external legal adjustments could have modified the trust without bank registration. The officer answered firmly that any such modification would require direct authorization from the primary beneficiary and would be recorded through official channels, none of which existed in their system. I sat quietly during this exchange, not interrupting, but listening as the structure of what I had been told over the past days began to collapse under the weight of documented fact. Jason's expression shifted again, no longer defensive, but uncertain in a way I had not seen before. The officer concluded by stating that if any misunderstanding had occurred within the family regarding ownership, it would need to be addressed outside the banking system, because their records remained unchanged and legally binding. When the meeting ended, we left the building in silence. Outside, the Texas air felt unchanged, but the space between the three of us had fundamentally altered. Jason did not speak as we walked to the cars, and Brittany avoided looking at me directly. I realized then that the truth had not been taken from me, as they had implied, but had been present all along, carefully preserved in a system they either did not fully understand or had chosen not to verify. The drive back from the bank felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because no one in the car seemed willing to acknowledge what had just been confirmed. Jason kept both hands on the steering wheel, his focus locked ahead, but the tension in his jaw made it clear he was replaying every word from the meeting. Brittany sat in the back seat, unusually quiet, her earlier certainty replaced by a controlled stillness that no longer felt confident. I looked out the window at the passing Texas landscape, but my thoughts were no longer on the road. They were on the bank officer's final statement, the one that had cut through every version of the story I had been given. The trust had never changed ownership. The system had never recorded any transfer. Everything Jason had claimed to be final was, in fact, incomplete. When we arrived home, Jason did not immediately get out of the car. He sat there for a moment with the engine still running, then finally turned off the ignition and said quietly that there must be another explanation, that legal processes sometimes lag behind internal arrangements. But even as he spoke, his voice lacked conviction. Brittany entered the house first, moving directly toward the kitchen as if trying to regain control of something tangible. Jason followed, but I remained standing near the entrance for a moment longer, observing them both not as family in conflict, but as people adjusting to a version of reality they had not prepared for. Inside, Brittany placed her hands on the counter and said that regardless of technical ownership, Jason had been managing responsibilities for months, and that continuity mattered more than documentation. Jason nodded at first, but then stopped, as if realizing that responsibility and ownership were not interchangeable concepts. I sat down slowly at the dining table, watching them attempt to rebuild certainty out of fragments that no longer aligned. Jason finally admitted, in a quieter tone, that he had relied entirely on the information provided to him after Robert's passing, and that he had never personally reviewed the original trust documents in full. That admission changed the air in the room. It was not dramatic, but it was final in a way that could not be reversed. Brittany immediately responded that the legal advisor had assured them everything was standard procedure, but Jason did not echo her confidence this time. Instead, he asked a question he had not asked before, whether it was possible that someone had misunderstood the scope of administrative access and assumed it meant full control. The question hung in the space without answer. I did not interrupt. I simply listened, because for the first time, they were no longer explaining things to me. They were questioning each other. Later that evening, after Jason stepped outside to take a call, Brittany remained in the kitchen longer than usual, her movements slower, less precise. She finally said, without looking at me, that she had only ever tried to make things easier for Jason, that after Robert's death everything had felt uncertain, and that she had assumed clarity where there was none. It was not a confession, but it was the closest thing to uncertainty I had heard from her. I did not respond immediately. Instead, I thought about Robert, about the way he always insisted that clarity mattered more than comfort, even when the truth was difficult. When Jason returned, he did not resume his earlier confidence. He simply said that they would need to speak again with legal counsel, not to confirm what they believed, but to understand what they had overlooked. For the first time since the funeral, the house no longer felt like a place where a decision had already been made. It felt like a place where assumptions were beginning to collapse under their own weight, and I understood that what came next would no longer be about defending what I had lost, but about revealing what had been hidden in plain sight. That night felt different from all the nights that had come before it, not because anything outside the house had changed, but because something irreversible had already shifted inside it. Jason returned from his call late, closing the front door more quietly than usual, as if the sound itself now required caution. Brittany was already upstairs, and the house settled into a silence that no longer felt neutral, but divided. I remained in the living room long after they had gone to their rooms, sitting in the same chair where Robert used to read in the evenings, trying to understand how quickly certainty could dissolve when built on incomplete truth. The events of the day replayed in my mind again and again, the bank officer's calm explanation, Jason's hesitation, Brittany's carefully chosen words that no longer sounded as confident as they once had. It was no longer a question of whether something had been misunderstood. It was a question of how long that misunderstanding had been maintained. The next morning, Jason came downstairs earlier than usual and told me that they had contacted legal counsel again, this time requesting a full review of the original trust structure without interpretation. His voice was different now, less declarative, more uncertain, as if he was no longer speaking from a position of assumed knowledge. Brittany followed shortly after, saying she had also requested access to all supporting documentation from Robert's financial records, not just summaries or secondary explanations. Neither of them looked at each other when speaking, and for the first time, their positions were no longer aligned. I did not interfere. I simply observed as the structure they had built began to separate under the weight of verification. By midday, Jason received a return call from the attorney overseeing the estate review. I was present in the room when he answered, and I could hear the shift in his tone almost immediately. The attorney explained that after cross-referencing bank records, legal filings, and trust registration data, there was no evidence of any completed transfer of ownership from the original trust to Jason or any other party. The words were simple, but their impact was not. Jason asked for clarification, his voice now noticeably restrained, and the attorney repeated that administrative access had been granted at certain points for management purposes, but ownership had never legally changed hands. Brittany sat down slowly when she heard this, placing her hand on the edge of the table as if needing physical stability. Jason looked at me briefly, not with accusation anymore, but with something closer to confusion that had nowhere left to go. The attorney continued, stating that the structure of the trust required continuous transparency and that any deviation from its conditions would have been flagged immediately within the system. There had been no such flag, no alteration, no override, only assumption. After the call ended, no one spoke for several seconds. Jason finally said, in a lower voice than I had ever heard from him before, that he had believed he was acting according to final instructions. Brittany responded quietly that she had only ever worked from what she had been told, never from what she had verified. The distinction between belief and confirmation now hung between them like something tangible and unavoidable. I stood up slowly and walked toward Robert's study once more, not because I needed new evidence, but because I needed to understand how something so carefully structured could have been misrepresented so completely. When I entered the room, nothing had changed physically, but everything had changed in meaning. The documents were still there, the system still intact, the clarity still preserved in places I had been told were already settled. I realized then that the truth had never been absent. It had simply been filtered through interpretation, and in that filtering, something essential had been lost. When I returned to the main room, Jason was sitting alone, and Brittany was standing by the window, both of them no longer speaking as a unified certainty, but as individuals trying to reconcile what they had assumed with what could now no longer be ignored.